Colonel Lincoln Farish here with my trusty pipe hawk. Let's talk about what happens after the revolution. Now remember, these are my thoughts, not endorsed by DoD, USK, SWIC, and probably not even some historians. What happens after the revolution? So I'm going to go talk a bit of history, but I'm going to have to gloss over a few things because I'm going to be covering a large swath. So apologies to any hardcore historians. But I'm talking effects on governance and the effect by governance. Prior to 1776, you usually had one absolute monarch defeat another absolute monarch, and that's who took over. With the exception of the English Civil War. So Charles I lost out to the parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell takes on the title of Lord Protector, i.e. dictator, but he died in 1658. His son tries to take over, which would be a monarchy, but he's not really as good or as competent. And so the Stuart monarchy was restored with Charles II as king. Again, absolute monarch. But even though the nobles would fight sometimes and squabble, and losers would lose, their lands or their titles, usually the peasants weren't massacred. And the question becomes why? And it's an economic one. You needed peasants to work the land. Everyone made their money off of agricultural products. If there was no agricultural products, there was no rents collected from the peasants and serfs and others. Without those, no way to for the king to tax the nobles, and government would grind to a halt because that's how the money was made. So while armies were paid by that, I mean that's also why armies were paid by loot. There was just no money to give them a regular salary. Massacres did happen, so, but they were rarely systematic with the intention of eradication. Even Arnaud Almeric's supposed kill them all, God knows his own quote, or, kill them all, let God sort them out, it's considered apocryphal hyperbole rather than historical. However, this changed in the 1500s, or the attitudes, with the efficiencies in agricultural products and with the adaptation of the Norfolk four-crop system, basically just a new way to farm that produced greater amounts of agricultural products. Well, with bumper crops, the amount you get per crop is reduced. Also, with efficiencies, the number of people you need to work the land goes down. So you start getting nobles not getting as much money for their rye or their barley or whatever, and they started the enclosure movement, throwing the peasants off the land and enclosing the area so that they had to deal with fewer people, and also because wool started really going up in price. So sheep came onto the property, peasants were shoved off the property, and they started going towards the cities, which helped start the Industrial Revolution. Farmers are shoved off their land and into the cities. So now you've got a bunch of idle, resentful, and easily replaceable workers in the beginnings of the industrial era. And the reason I say this is because being a farmer is difficult, time consuming, you have to know a lot, but working in a mill, especially at this time, you were easily replaceable. It did not take long to learn how to work a loom. So the economics started to shift. And instead of, being a critical part of society and economics as a farmer, you're now an easily replaceable worker. You're a resource instead of a critical part. And so starting in about 1776, if a successful revolution happened, you had a bad government that was traded for a worse one with massive systemic violence, the victor more interested in punishment than governance, mob vengeance, scapegoating, rejection of prior customs, norms, and laws, usually with no ready replacement, which makes governance and stability very difficult. The American Revolution, I believe, is the exception which proves the rule. And the reason for that is when the American Revolution kicked off, about a third of the country were Tories, or as the British would call them, loyalists. One third didn't care one way or the other, and one third were patriots. And the population is about 2.5 million. So after Cornwallis surrenders and eventually they evacuate, what happened? Well, the Tories, about 80,000 of them, fled to various places, to include Ben Franklin's son, William Franklin, the last colonial governor of New Jersey. Now, land was confiscated or claimed if the owner had fled to Canada, but despite some really nasty raids and massacres, when the war was over, it was over. And Cornwallis signed the Article of Capitulation in 1781, but the Treaty of Paris didn't happen until 1783. So there were 2 years where we had all these POWs. The British were still occupying various places, mostly New York City, and there was no real reprisals or any problems with that, despite some nasty stuff. And as you can see, one near reprisal. I'm going to give you 2 big examples where provocation existed from the British that were met with restraint by the Americans. The first is Butler's Rangers. The guy on the left there is Lieutenant Colonel John Butler. He was a New Yorker and a Tory, supported the king, fled to Canada in 1775. Because he had fought for the British in the French Indian War, he was given a commission, eventually made lieutenant colonel, and was allowed to form a battalion called Butler's Rangers. About 570 men, 10 companies. He also brought with him various members of the Iroquois Tribal Confederation with him on his raids, because that's what Rangers did. They would conduct raids behind enemy lines to destroy infrastructure, burn farms, kill cattle, stuff like that. And they were unfortunately very effective at this and basically chased most of the farmers out of upstate New York, Fingers Lake, those places like that. Only problem was they got carried away a few times, and while attacking a fort in a place called Cherry Valley, they ended up killing off a bunch of women and children. The Iroquois with them did. And then at the Battle of Wyoming, the Iroquois refused to take any prisoners, scalping them and defiling the dead. As you can imagine, people were rather upset about this, but Butler was never held to account, nor his men. Washington did send the Sullivan expedition to break the back of the Iroquois by, in turn, destroying their villages. So no massacres occurred, but the Iroquois were effectively chased out of the United States into Canada or into the very northern parts of New York, and were never again a problem during the Revolution. The second example is the Asgill Affair. So after Yorktown, Cornwallis signs the Articles of Capitulation. One of the articles said there weren't going to be any reprisals. And the French sign, Washington signs, Cornwallis signs. Cornwallis's men are interred in POW camps, and Washington goes up to a place called Newburgh, New York, near West Point, to wait for the peace treaty to be signed. It takes about 2 years. Problem was, not everyone was waiting for peace. So a patriot mob attacked Tory farmers in New Jersey. There was a guy named Philip White who died. Now, he happened to be the brother-in-law of a Tory irregular captain, Captain Lippincott. Captain Lippincott goes to one of the prison barges where a bunch of patriots were being held. And these prison barges were terrible conditions. About 10,000 Americans died on these prison barges. That's how bad they were. 10,000 was more than died in combat. Another provocation that the Americans did not do instead, because, again, we had all the British sitting in POW camps. We easily could have conducted reprisals and chose not to. So in any event, Lippincott grabs a guy named Captain Jack Huddy, who had nothing to do with the death of his brother-in-law. Supposedly, Huddy was going to be traded in a prisoner exchange. And Lippincott takes him off the prison barge, rows him to shore, and then promptly hangs him and leaves a note explaining why they, killed Captain Huddy. Now, Huddy was a regular commissioned guy, so of course Washington and everyone's kind of losing their mind. And Washington says, "Hey, you got to court-martial this guy. You can't do stuff like this." And the British very reluctantly said, "Okay," and they court-martial him. Well, Lippincott's lawyers say, "Hey, he's an irregular. He's not really commissioned by the British. Therefore, he's not subject to British court-martial proceedings." And the British said, "Okay, give him to the civilian courts." Well, the civilian courts were controlled by Tories, again, supporting the king. And their excuse was, "Oh, well, the murder occurred outside of British control. Therefore, we don't have any jurisdiction." And so Lippincott got to come back to the British and was, in protective custody, basically. And everyone's losing their mind. So Washington says, "Fine, I'm going to select a British captain and I'm going to hang him." And they chose lots, and a guy named Captain Asgill was selected. And he started to go south to where he's going to be executed. However, cooler heads prevailed, and the French got involved and said, "Hey, wait a minute, we signed off on these articles of capitulation saying no reprisals. You can't do this." Took a little while, but eventually Captain Asgill was sent off to London, got to meet the king. Um, and again, despite a clear provocation, the Americans did not reciprocate. The French Revolution stands in stark contrast to the American Revolution. Both had worldwide implication, but it's the French Revolution that has been replicated time and time again, not only with a top-down structure, but also with a treatment of opposition forces. The revolution lasted about 10 years, and in 1789, France was heavily in debt despite high taxes and had a 56 million franc budget deficit. There was a lack of social mobility that caused resentment. They basically had three groups. You had the nobility, the clergy, and everybody else. And the ability to move into those was very limited, as well as it was seen that the clergy and the nobility got special dispensation based on their status, which was heavily resented. Another problem that was going on was France had grown to about 28 million due to better hygiene and other practices, but agriculturally was not able to keep up. They were still using the three-crop rotation method instead of the more innovative Norfolk method. So food shortages and famine started becoming common. Now, because of how things were structured, the clergy and the nobility were able to withstand these a little better, which bred further resentment. Additionally, France lost to England in 1763, something that hadn't happened very often, which came as a bit of a shock to France. And part of the Treaty of 1763 was they had to give up their North American colonies. Well, France pulled a fast one, and the year prior they had secretly traded their colonies to Spain with the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Problem was, nobody knew about it. So even though economically colonies are usually a money drain, and after the fur trade and the beaver trade had collapsed, France wasn't throwing away money on this, it still looked like to everybody else that they had lost to England and then had been further humiliated. There was another problem with the French army. It had a major morale issue because Louis XVI had stopped the practice of promoting officers from the NCO ranks and instead favored aristocrats, many of whom were incompetent or absentee commanders. Paris is now full of angry, hungry people looking for solutions to their problems. And Louis XVI calls for an Estates General, which is done to raise taxes. Hadn't been done in 160 years, which is showing weakness in the monarchy. Now, the Estates General is composed of the clergy, the nobility, and the common folk, the third estate. And each estate has the same amount of votes. The common folk, who had the largest body, wanted to go for each person there got a vote, which would give them the greatest power, which of course nobody else wanted to have. Things spiral out of control. You get riots. Eventually the Bastille is attacked. The local populace massacre the governor and the Paris of France for good measure. And Louis XVI makes the mistake of saying, okay, I'll give in to your demands. And the third estate, which has the largest voting bloc, begins to start writing legislation and forcing it through. The storming of the Bastille led a match in the rest of France, and there were popular uprisings throughout the place. And this is called the Great Fear in English, where nobility said, you know what, peace out, I'm gone, and they fled France for places elsewhere, which of course just weakened the king and his position. So the National Assembly is able to vote on abolishing feudalism. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen sets itself up not only as a legislature, but the drafter of the new Constitution, and creates paper money. Now, here's the problem. They got rid of the old Constitution when they abolished feudalism, but they didn't have a new Constitution ready to go. So, who appoints judges? Who's supposed to collect excise taxes? How are, inspections supposed to go of meat and dairy products? And no one really knew. And this just led to more problems and more confusion and more issues. But the National Assembly looked more for ways to control the mob rather than fix the problem. So popular uprisings are still ongoing in the fall of 1789 throughout France. The feudalism has been abolished. The Rights of Man have been published. And then in October, there's the March on Versailles. It's called the Women's March, and there's a depiction of it. A lot of propaganda started to happen where it was pitting the common folk against the nobility, or the common folk against the clergy, or the common folk against, tyrants and other things, but it really wasn't true. So supposedly, a bunch of women marched on Versailles because bread prices had gotten too high, rounded up the king, and brought him back. Not exactly what happened. So there was an uprising, and 7,000 women, some say 5, some say 10, we'll go with 7, armed with cannon and other muskets, did march on Versailles. Their ability to use any of this remains in doubt. But accompanying them were 20,000 National Guardsmen under the command of Lafayette, the same Lafayette that helped out during the American Revolution. Now, when they got to Versailles, Versailles was not a fortress and had been open to the public, so it was pretty easy to get around in it. And they forced their way in towards the royal apartments. And after a tense 24 hours where everyone was really worried that a bloodbath was about to ensue, they forced the king, along with his wife and others, to return to Paris under the protection of the National Guard. Now, this really legitimized the National Assembly and weakened the king's position. Now, this wasn't spontaneous as it was depicted, nor was it only with women. It did occur, but the propaganda is the picture. What really happened was Marat and a bunch of others stirred the pie until people finally exploded. And one of them, Marat's L'Ami du Peuple, which is the friend of the people, claimed that drunken soldiers had insulted the revolution by throwing tricolor cockades onto the floor, then stomping and urinating on them. What had actually happened is a bunch of soldiers had been called from the frontier to help protect the king in Versailles. Marat made it seem like a drunken orgy had taken place, insulting the revolution while, eating lots of food and basically thumbing their noses at the common folk. So revolutionaries like Marat and others riled up the mob and then benefited from their actions while all maintaining it was spontaneous. So now it starts becoming time to consolidate power. The National Assembly has more or less neutered the king, the aristocracy, and the church, but they still haven't fixed any of the problems. So to start appeasing people or to get whatever money they possibly could, they nationalized the church, said, all right, all you priests now work for us and all your property belongs to us. Tried to sell off the land as best they could, but of course got pennies on the dollar, or pennies on the franc. And they removed the ability of the church to assign tithes. Despite their attempts, France was still broke and hungry. More riots break out, but by September 1791, just a mere 25 months after getting rid of feudalism, there's a new constitution. However, quickly they realized that constitution wasn't going to work, so they started modifying it. By December, deputies within the National Assembly are immune from tribunals. And if there is a trial, they select the judge, jury, and prosecutor. Whether or not you can have legal representation is kind of up in the air, and it's not a neutral attempt to find facts, but in fact becomes more of an oratory competition. 1792. So the National Assembly's been in charge 3 odd years, hasn't managed to fix many problems. People are upset. In August, the Paris Commune forms an insurrection committee and they attack where the king's being held. They arrest the king, manage to slaughter his guards, and drag him off to prison. The monarchy is then abolished. Following that uprising, we have the September massacres, with our good buddy Marat writing to people saying, hey, kill those prisoners because they're getting to be difficult and they're bad people. So prisoners are dragged from their cells and summarily executed. 1793, this is where things really start to go sideways for France. In December of 92, they had put the king on trial, and then in 1793, in January, they executed him publicly for the crowd to approve. Then in March, the Vendée said, hey, these drafts that you keep going, they called them a levy at the time, these levies, we don't care for them because we're tired of sending our sons and husbands off to war. And they revolted. Well, that started a war in the Vendée, which lasted for about 3 years. Very brutal. We'll get to that here in a second. Then in April, the Committee on Public Safety was created. And then at the end of May, once again, at the beginning of June, once again, the Paris Commune went insurrection-y. And they surrounded the National Assembly building, and they said, hey, the Girondians that didn't vote for the execution of the king, they're weak, and we want them arrested. So the National Assembly, being super, super brave, said, here you go. They also threw out their Minister of the Treasury, because the problem they had was the paper money that the National Assembly had authorized. Nobody really wanted it. It was inflated, and they couldn't do much trade. People wanted gold and silver at the time. But rather than just admit that maybe they need to fix a few things, they just kept printing paper, and then when things went wrong, blamed the Minister of Finance for it. Then in June, so the Girondians were removed, about 20 of them were removed, put under house arrest, and by October they'd all been executed. Then in June, the new constitution was approved and quickly was ignored. Also in June, Lyons, second largest city in France, and the economic powerhouse, revolted. Now the problem was, Lyons was where all the silk manufacturing went on, a lot of textiles, other things like that. So it really brought money to the table. And they were tired of the Jacobeans being all kinds of radical. And they said, we need some more moderation. And the National Assembly said, we can't have any of this counter-revolution stuff. So they suppressed the revolt in Lyons by basically destroying half the town. And anyone they captured was executed within 24 hours, as directed by the National Assembly. And then in July, Marat was assassinated by Charlotte Corday. Now, Charlotte maintained that the only reason she assassinated Marat was because of the September massacres. That's where Marat and others had convinced the Paris Commune to attack the jails, pull the prisoners out, and summarily execute them. As a matter of fact, Marat was writing letters in his bathtub suggesting that supporters in other towns do the same exact thing when Charlotte went and stabbed him. Now that Marat was dead, he could be successfully turned into an icon and a martyr of the revolution, which then gave the other members of the revolution, the other Jacobeans, a fig leaf to say, hey, the only reason we're doing these things is because people like Miss Corday are assassinating us. We're only doing terrible things because our enemies are so terrible. So Marat becomes a hero of the revolution. They hire the best artist in all of France to paint the death of Marat. There's a bunch of other ones. You can find the death of Marat online. There's a bunch of other paintings there, all showing how, terrible and horrible this was. And it became, again, another propaganda piece for everyone to hide what they were doing. October, the Constitution that had just been put into place in June was suspended due to the emergency. And a revolutionary government was in charge for the duration of the emergency. And they said, hey, we need to set up tribunals to take care of these counter-revolutionaries and people who believe in the clergy and crypto-royalists and other, bad elements. So they created about 60 military commissions with the purpose of finding these people and executing them quickly, which they did by the thousands. Then in November, a guy named Jean-Baptiste Carrier was in Nantes, which is part of the Vendée, and they had a problem. They had about 4,000 prisoners crammed into a place that could only hold a couple hundred. And it was going to take too long to hold real trials for them. So they cobbled together a quick, drumhead jury, and by the hundreds convicted everybody and sentenced them to death. And the fastest way that Carrier thought to go ahead and take care of his duties was to row the people out in the middle of the night, tie them together, and then throw them off into the Loire River. And he did that for about 4,000 people, to include women, children, priests, nuns, and everybody else. So War in the Vendée, 1793 to 1796. It was ugly and brutal. So the actual uprising was pretty much crushed by the end of 1793. The general, or one of the generals in charge, wrote back after the Battle of Sèvres, "The Vendée is no more. According to your orders, I have trampled their children beneath our horses' feet. I have massacred their women, so they will no longer give birth to brigands. I do not have a single prisoner to reproach me. I have exterminated them all." There's some historical, there's some questions as to whether or not that's historically accurate, but it can't be denied that the National Assembly went full scorched earth on them. Scorched earth was actually the policy. They had what was called infernal columns, colonies infernalis, and they went scorched earth. Farms were destroyed, crops and forests burned, villages razed, atrocities in a campaign of mass killings. Women were specifically targeted. Then from January to May of '94, between 20 and 50,000 Vendean civilians were massacred. And then in Anjou, of the 15,000 that were captured, 7,000 were shot or guillotined, and 2,200 about died from disease. So the Reign of Terror, June to July, 93 to 1794. Now the Herbertists were another moderate group. They'd been purged. The Dantonists had been purged and executed. You had your 4,000 killed off in Nantes. Again, women, children, civilians. Officially, less than 17,000 were executed by the guillotine, but you had 300,000 people arrested, with another 10,000 died in prison that we know of. That doesn't count the military commissions, the uprisings, or anything else. And in June of 1794, a new law was passed called the Law of 22 Parental. Now, this further refined what enemies of the people were, but it was really vague. And you didn't have legal counsel if you were accused, and the only sentence was death. People started getting a little uncomfortable about this, especially in the National Assembly. And Robespierre is one step short of a dictator. He's in charge of the Committee of Public Safety. And he gives a big old speech railing against enemies and conspiracies all around. And that unites the rest of the convention, probably mostly due to self-preservation, to plan and execute a coup against him. Robespierre was publicly denounced, and an order for his arrest called for by the Committee on Public Safety, minus himself, of course. And he and his followers were rounded up and imprisoned. However, somehow they escaped custody, and they fled to one of the local Jacobean clubs. The next morning, more soldiers showed up from the National Assembly to arrest them. And during the altercation, several members of the Robespierre group were injured, to include Robespierre. Whether he shot himself or not is open to some controversy, but about half his face was blown off. So, because Robespierre had championed the Law of 22 Parental, he was now subject to it. And remember, there was no legal counsel. The only sentence was death. So he and 21 associates were then executed. This, however, did not stop the problems. So now that the Jacobeans have been effectively wiped out, you have what's called the White Terror, where the Jacobean club members and associates were hunted by paramilitary muscadine organized by the new government. So we've gone from one group of people who can't quite run the country for another, and we still have violence all over the place. So the Committee of Public Safety is more or less disbanded, and the Revolutionary Council is reformed, and you have what's called the Directorate, and this lasts for about 4 years in various iterations. But it is a 5-member committee that replaced the Committee of Public Safety. However, they actually managed to get stuff accomplished. They stabilized the finances. They minted bullion. Granted, it was confiscated silver from the clergy and nobility, but no longer paper money, and so they're able to start conducting trade. Napoleon was running rampage through Italy and extorting money from them, sending it back to France. Food supplies started to increase. No more famines, no more hungry people running around. However, despite the White Terror and the Muscadines busy trying to execute every last Jacobean they could find, the Jacobean sentiment started to slither back, and by 1799 they reopened clubs and were calling for more revolutionary measures to be taken. Napoleon returned to France in 9 November 1799, took a look around, and a month later said, "I can run this place better." So he formed a coup d'etat. So we went from executing the king to now having an emperor, with lots and lots of violence in between. So in comparison with the American Revolution, the French Revolution replaced the previous government and governance with no plan. It Took them 2 years to write up a constitution, and they never followed the constitution. They came up with great plans to rename the days of the week and things like this, but they were never able to figure out how to work finances. Customs and norms were cast aside with no ready replacement, which makes stability and governance rather difficult. This gave rise to a lot of violence. There was a top-down authority and leadership style within the French Revolution. We're the Committee on Public Safety. This is what we say is counter-revolutionary, and if you disagree, well, we're going to execute you. The French Revolution used propaganda to justify excesses. The only reason we're killing all these people is because they're counter-revolutionaries and they deserve what they get. The French Revolution fed the mob. They kowtowed to him. When Napoleon was faced with the mob, he lit him up with grape shot. Violence and terror was used as a state function to help keep the population in line. What they did in the Vendée and what they did to Lyons happened throughout the country. So the French Revolution was violent, bloody, ended up going from a king to an emperor, didn't really solve most of France's problems, and unfortunately has become a blueprint for a lot of other revolutions since then. However, there is an exception, and that's Mexico. We'll get to that here next. Mexico and the Mexican Revolution were a lot like the French Revolution with a neat twist. So Mexico started off as a viceroyalty of New Spain for about 300 years, and Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808. The old king wasn't doing so hot. His son decided he wanted to be in charge, and Napoleon said, "You know what? I'm putting my brother in charge." So the nobility accepted it, but the common people were like, no, we're not having this. We want our king back. Meanwhile, Mexico and South and Central America said, whoa, whoa. All right, you guys aren't going to be in charge. We're going to set up our own thing. And the first attempt in Mexico, at least, to go their own way started in 1810. About 11 years later, Augustin Iturbide had effectively gained control of the country. Now, despite the fact that they had declared independence, Spain was like, yeah, no, you still belong to us, even though it was run by, Napoleon's brother. So Iturbide starts off as president and then decides, you know what? Emperor of Mexico sounds a whole lot better. However, not everyone was down with this plan, so he abdicated a couple years later rather than risk a civil war. Says, okay, you know what? Peace out. I'm out of here. Takes off, but he's lured back to Mexico, promptly arrested, and then executed. And this starts to become a theme. So 1823 to 24, they have a provisional government. In 1829, Spain had successfully gotten rid of Napoleon's brother, reestablished themselves as a country, and said, you know what, Mexico, you're coming back with us. Fought it out, lost. Remember, 1829 is also when Mexico had abolished slavery and told those Texans, hey, stop, you Americans, stop coming into Texas. We don't like that stuff. So in any event, at the Battle of Tampico, Spain lost to Mexico, and you get the continuation of the First Federal Republic. Now, the interesting part is only the very first president, Guadalupe Victoria, completed his entire term. A lot of sentiment. A lot of people thought they could do a better job of running Mexico for the first 100 years, and were perfectly willing to shed blood to show that they could do it. Then in 1835, you have the Centralist Republic of Mexico. You have the 7 laws replacing the Constitution, massive political instability, revolts. Texas revolts, makes it stick by defeating Santa Anna in 36. California revolts in 36, becomes semi-independent. New Mexico follows in 37, but Mexico says, you know what, New Mexico, you're back with us. In 38, they'd crushed the rebellion. And then France blockaded Veracruz. Meanwhile, the Americans were trying to figure out how they could annex Texas and what that would mean. Mexico is in a bit of trouble here. They've got 2 different provinces that have successfully revolted, Texas and California. France has shown up and taken over Veracruz saying, hey, where's that money we loaned you? And in 1845, Texans are becoming Americans, but despite defeating Santa Anna, there was no border established that everyone was agreeing with. Polk had tried to buy the Nueces Strip, but that wasn't working out because Mexico wasn't really able to negotiate. They had 4 different presidents, 6 different war ministers, 16 different finance ministers. Who are you going to give money to, or who are you going to negotiate with? It's just a constant churn of government officials. So U.S. forces entered the disputed territory after the Mexican President Paredes, declared all of Texas, Mexican territory. He said, "We will uphold the integrity of Mexico territory to the Sabine River." The Sabine River is over by Louisiana. So basically he's saying, yeah, all that Texas independence, yeah, that's not happening. Well, Mexican soldiers crossed the Rio Grande, ambushed the Americans there in the disputed territory, killing 11 and capturing the rest. And now it's on. 1846 was a good news, bad news situation for Mexico. Good news is Mexico was stable enough to restore the Constitution of 1824. Bad news is they're losing to the Americans badly. Ends up the Americans take over the whole place, camped out in Mexico City, and the father of civil affairs is running the whole shebang. You have the Second Federal Republic of Mexico from 46 to 63. You had 5 presidents in 47. Finally, in 1948, we complete the Mexican-American War with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico loses Texas to the Rio Grande, California and New Mexico. Good news, however, they get $15 million US and $3.25 million of debt forgiveness. So, good and bad. 1848 to 51, Jose Joaquin de Herrera becomes president. He is the second Mexican president to complete a term and peacefully transition power. From 1821 to 1857, you had 50 different governments ruling the country, kind of, sort of. Now, by 1850, liberals saw this, or started to say, that French Revolution, that was cool. We should do that here. And the liberals had gained power by dealing with the Americans via the Mexican-American War. So the liberals put together this plan. They were going to seize church lands and weaken the Mexican military, and then they would have that promised utopia. So in 1857, they developed a new constitution, which once adopted, they plunged the country into civil war, which is called the Reform War from 1857 to 1860. The U.S. sided with the liberals because they had a constitution, but Mexico was pretty much beating them about the head and ears until they retreated to Veracruz, where the U.S. helped blockade the area, and that was the Battle of Anton Lizardo. Conservatives were unable to break the blockade, liberals are able to regroup, and eventually retook most of the country, and they won, sort of. Then the French showed up. France, Spain, and UK had all loaned money to Mexico, and Mexico was not really good about paying it back. So they showed up and they said, hey, cough it up. We're here to collect. And Spain and the British were able to secure an agreement in 1862, and they took off. France, however, was like, this looks like a good place to expand. Now, Napoleon III of France was in charge, and he offered the younger brother of the Austrian Emperor, Franz Joseph, the opportunity to rule Mexico, and he accepted. So the new Emperor of Mexico calls himself Maximilian I. He and his wife do terrible things like set up schools and hospitals, clean up the streets. They restrict the working hours. Maximilian abolishes child labor. He canceled all the debts for peasants over 10 pesos. He restored communal property. He outlawed corporal punishment and got rid of company stores. And debt bondage. Debt bondage is different from slavery, sort of. But what happens with debt bondage is you owe me money, so now you have to go work for me. And I make sure that you never make enough money to pay me back. And if I get tired of you, or I need some cash, I then sell your debt to someone else. So you're not a slave, sort of. So, 1865, U.S. stops stomping all over the South, frees the slaves, and notices there's a violation of the Monroe Doctrine going on. So, they're like, hey, France, what's up with that? The U.S. starts supplying partisans, tells France, hey, you can't be putting troops in Mexico, man. And then by 1866, France had withdrew its troops due to U.S. pressure and Prussian threats on its border. So France was kind of like, Maximilian, you're on your own. Well, problem was, Maximilian's supporters start to desert him, to include folks in Europe. By 1867, liberals have retaken Mexico City because, all those terrible things Maximilian's done for the country. Maximilian refuses to abandon his supporters, is captured, and executed. Once Mexico got rid of Emperor Maximilian and all the terrible things he did, like ending child labor, they settled into a mostly stable government from 67 to 1911, with President Porfirio Diaz winning election after election. Problem was, he couldn't find a way to step down from that sweet, sweet power. So he rigged the election of 1910 and imprisoned the guy running against him, Francisco Madero. And not only did he rig the election, he did such a bad job of it, it was obvious. So revolution broke out. Madero got support from Pancho Villa, Orozco, Zapata brothers, a bunch of others. And they pretty much kicked the stuffing out of Diaz's men. Diaz says, you know what, I'm going to go to France and live out my days, and he takes off. Wars finally stop with the Treaty of Ciudad Juarez, and Francisco Madero becomes president. Problem is, supporters have turned on him. Revolution breaks out again in February of 1913, and Victoriano Huerta betrays Madero, seizes power. So we're going to try something a little different here. Huerta militarizes Mexico, rules with an iron hand, executes the disloyal and job lots, shuts down Congress while it's in session, and arrests 110 senators and deputies. 74 were charged with high treason and either executed or were sentenced to be executed. Then the Tampico Affair occurs. Tampico Affair was where 9 sailors had come ashore to buy supplies for U.S. ships. They supposedly had gone into a forbidden area and were arrested and then paraded through the streets. Probably had to dance the hornpiper and sing sea shanties as well. So terrible, terrible abuse. And the admiral says, hey, whoa, you can't do this, Mexico. We demand an apology and return the sailors and, salute the American flag and a 21-gun salute. And Mexico is like, no. So Woodrow Wilson says, you know what? I think that admiral's right. Let's go occupy Veracruz, which we talked about in the history of civil affairs. This weakens Huerta to the point where he resigned. Then you have a couple more presidents come and go. Things get a little more stable. And by 1920, things are kind of calm-ish. So by my count, from 1821 to present, you've had about 119 various executives in every form of government, from a junta to a dictator to a regent, emperors, committees. You had one president die in office of natural causes, Benito Juarez in 1872, and only one president assassinated in office, and that is Venustiano Carranza in 1920. So a little bit better than the U.S. as far as killing the people in power, but the transitions really gets Mexico. That's where it hurts. Now, despite all the problems that Mexico's had since independence, both foreign and internal, Mexico is still a really big and powerful country. They're part of the G20, GDP of 2.6 trillion, growth of 2.2%. Huge on a global scale. It's only because they're next to the United States that they look small in comparison. And again, Mexico's problem was not so much with being in power, it was the transition of power from one group to another. All right, so wholesale slaughter is not the only way independence occurs. You've got 3 good examples, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all provinces of Great Britain. And they all sued for independence by different means and peacefully transitioned. So 31, Canada petitions Great Britain. In 82, Great Britain says, okay, little buddy, you can go do your own thing. Australia became a republic in 99, still keeps King Charles. New Zealand had been mostly self-governing since 1852, became a dominion in 1907, and then in 47 was allowed to go forth and do its own thing, again, still keeping the king. In more modern times, you have the color revolutions, a couple of those that popped up where there was a more or less peaceful transition. So it is possible that this can occur, but by and large, there's just 3 ways for a revolution to occur. In the end, there are 3 styles of revolution and transition. You have the American style, which is measured more or less a peaceful transition, goes stable to stable. And the dissolution of the British Empire is a good example of that. And a more recent example would be the color revolutions, some of which were very peaceful. Then, in opposition to that, and much more common, is the French style, which is kill everyone, keep the corruption. One of the complaints with the ancient regime was the king had the ability to lock people up without due process. So when the Committee on Public Safety took over, they locked people up without due process. Bad. And the problem is this has become the exemplar for many, many, many other revolutions. The Russian Revolution, the China Revolution, Cambodia Revolution. Lots of bodies, lots of corruption, lots of tyranny. The Mexican style is similar to the French style, but with a twist. You seize power, you get stable, but the transitions, they just do not work until revolution has reared its head and the place is being burned down around you. Examples of that would be Liberia, Kenya, Somalia. Not as many bodies as the French style, not as peaceful as the American style. It's the transitions that gets everyone with the Mexican style. Final thoughts. Revolutions tend to replace a bad government with a worse one. You often get autocrats who seem to fill graveyards with their enemies. You get repressions and reprisals that lead to cycles of violence. The Muscadines are killing off the Jacobeans because the Jacobeans are killing off the Girondians, and you just keep this cycle of violence and destruction going. So any infrastructure that had been left by the revolution is now destroyed in the fighting for power. Standard of living goes down even further. If it goes far enough, you hit anarchy, and at that point, all bets are off. So these kind of reprisals can massively destabilize a country for decades. There are countries that went through revolution in the 40s and 50s that still haven't recovered. And civil affairs' role in this, and the reason the US government's interested in this, is because bad governance can be fixed. Once you hit anarchy, all bets are off. It could be decades before you get back to some sort of level of stability and governance. And you may never really be able to get back to where it was before the revolution. This was a long one, so I'm going to keep this super short. My recommendation for book is The Beginner's Guide to Nation Building by the Rand Corporation. Excellent primer on how to help a country that's been chewed up by revolution or other events get back onto the road towards good governance. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out or email me.